It began with a locked service corridor, a sealed inventory sheet, and a palace staffer who reportedly confirmed what Buckingham Palace never wanted spoken aloud. It began with a locked service corridor, a sealed inventory sheet, and a palace staffer who reportedly confirmed what Buckingham Palace never wanted spoken aloud. Camilla's wardrobe had been quietly cleared from the East Wing. Not announced, not explained, simply removed. And within royal walls, that kind of silence is never empty. It is usually the first sound of a power shift. Reports suggest the first sign came late, when certain East Wing staff allegedly noticed wardrobe cases being moved under unusual discretion. These were not ordinary trunks being shifted for seasonal storage. According to palace whispers, they were personal rails, garment covers, ceremonial pieces, and private labels quietly taken out of spaces long associated with Camilla's royal presence. No formal notice was issued. No public explanation followed, and that silence inside Buckingham Palace carried more weight than any announcement ever could. Because the East Wing was never just a place to store clothing. Within the hidden language of monarchy, rooms matter. Access matters. Which corridor one may enter, which cabinet one may open, which staff member responds to which household, all of it speaks to rank, influence, and trust. So when aides were reportedly told not to discuss what some called domestic rearrangements, the phrase only deepened the suspicion. In palace terms, a domestic rearrangement can mean a curtain moved, a schedule adjusted, or something far more devastating, a boundary redrawn. For Camilla, the alleged clearance was not merely personal. It landed at the heart of a growing question that had been circling quietly since the strain around King Charles's reign became impossible to ignore. How much authority still belonged to her household? How much had been tolerated because of Charles's protection? And how much was now being reconsidered by those who believed the crown must be defended from any private circle becoming too comfortable inside royal machinery? Insiders claimed the most unsettling detail was not the movement of the wardrobe itself, but the absence that followed. Certain arrangements reportedly continued without Camilla's visible imprint. Certain staff lines became colder. Certain familiar assumptions no longer seemed safe. And in that gap, palace watchers began to sense a deeper shift, the kind that starts with locked doors, spreads through whispered instructions, and ends with someone realizing that power has moved before anyone dared to say it aloud. According to palace administrative whispers, the East Wing inventory was never meant to become a story. It was supposed to look routine. Garment bags logged, private labels removed, staff rotations adjusted. But insiders claim one detail changed everything. The clearance was allegedly marked under restricted household authority, meaning this was not housekeeping. It was protocol. And that word, protocol, is where the entire atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace reportedly changed. Because in royal life, housekeeping can be explained away. A wardrobe can be moved for renovation, fabric preservation, seasonal rotation, or private preference. But restricted household authority suggests something colder, something controlled, something that did not come from a dresser simply organizing gowns or aides refreshing a room. It suggests a chain of approval. It suggests signatures. It suggests that somewhere behind the polished language of palace administration, someone had decided that Camilla's presence in that part of the East Wing needed to be quietly reduced. The East Wing, insiders whisper, was never merely private space. It was symbolic ground, the kind of ground that told staff who mattered, who could request what, who carried weight, and who was protected by the invisible machinery of the crown. So when certain garments were reportedly missing before any explanation reached the wider household, the silence did not feel accidental. It felt deliberate. Staff who once moved easily around familiar instructions allegedly began asking fewer questions. Aides who might normally clarify a household change reportedly kept their answers vague. And within palace walls, vagueness can be more alarming than denial. That is why some observers are now connecting the alleged clearance to a much larger internal recalibration. References to household memoranda, red box decisions, and domestic chains of command have begun to circulate in whispers. Not because anyone has publicly confirmed a dramatic rupture, but because the pattern feels too precise to dismiss, a wardrobe removed quietly, labels stripped carefully, access implied but not explained. This was not the chaos of embarrassment. It was the orderliness of control. And if Camilla's household access was truly being narrowed, then the message would have been devastating in its simplicity: no public confrontation, no official humiliation, no dramatic declaration from King Charles, just the slow closing of a door, the silent removal of personal traces, and the unmistakable feeling that the palace had begun protecting itself through bureaucracy. This was the kind of warfare the old guard understood best. Not loud, not emotional, not reckless, but surgical. A correction made through inventory sheets and restricted authority carrying the force of something far greater than decoration. To outsiders, a wardrobe is fabric, labels, shoes, and ceremonial coats. But inside Buckingham Palace, every rail carries rank. Every room carries permission. Every locked cabinet carries history. And reports suggest Camilla's East Wing wardrobe had become something far larger than fashion. It had become a quiet marker of how deeply her presence had entered the royal machine. That is why the alleged clearance struck palace watchers with such force. Because in the royal world, clothing is never only clothing. A coronation robe is not merely fabric. A state dinner gown is not just a private choice. A carefully stored coat, a hatbox, a ceremonial outfit prepared for future appearances, all of it speaks in the silent language of status. It tells staff who must be accommodated, who must be protected, who is expected to remain visible, and who is being prepared for the next great moment of royal display. So if Camilla's East Wing wardrobe was truly reduced, removed, or quietly reclassified, then the meaning was colder than embarrassment. It suggested that a symbol of permanence had been touched. Insiders whisper that this is what made the moment so devastating. Since the sun-drenched coronation of 2023, Camilla's public position had seemed sealed in gold. She had stood beside King Charles at the highest altar of monarchy, accepted the crown, and stepped into a role that had once seemed impossible. For years, her rise had been described by supporters as a story of endurance, patience, and eventual acceptance. But the palace has a brutal memory. It does not only remember ceremonies. It remembers precedent. It remembers loyalty. It remembers which influence belongs to the crown and which influence only survives because a monarch allows it. That is where the East Wing reportedly became more than a domestic space. It became a quiet measurement of soft power. If her wardrobe remained fully installed, her household remained rooted. If her garments were prepared, her role was assumed. If her staff had access, her presence remained woven into the daily rhythm of Buckingham Palace. But if those rails were emptied, if labels were removed, if private storage was altered under controlled authority, then the message was not shouted, it was administered. The palace was not simply tidying rooms. It was possibly rewriting who belonged where. And for Camilla, that would have been the sharpest cut of all, not a public insult, not a dramatic confrontation, but a silent correction that turned private comfort into institutional warning. What had once looked like security now seemed vulnerable. What had once looked like victory now carried the shadow of reversal, and what had once been presented as settled royal acceptance began to feel in the eyes of some insiders like something the old guard had only tolerated until the right moment arrived. The most devastating palace moves rarely come with slammed doors. They come with quiet signatures, revised schedules, reassigned rooms, and staff who suddenly stop answering familiar requests. Insiders whisper that the old guard did not need a public confrontation with Camilla. They only needed one thing, a household order no one could reverse without exposing the battle. And that, according to palace whispers, is where Princess Anne and Prince Edward quietly entered the story, not as loud opponents, not as public critics, but as guardians of the fine print. And has long been seen by royal watchers as the iron-willed defender of duty, the one who understands that monarchy survives not through emotion but through discipline. Edward, quieter but no less important, has often been framed as the careful sentinel of procedure, the man who knows that a single document correctly placed can carry more force than 1,000 arguments. Together, insiders suggest they represented the old guard's most powerful weapon, protocol. The alleged doctrine now being whispered around the household is being called by some the East Wing Covenant, a phrase that sounds almost too dramatic yet perfectly captures the meaning of the moment. It was not about fabric. It was not about furniture. It was about whether Camilla's domestic presence inside Buckingham Palace had expanded beyond what certain senior figures believed was safe for the institution. And if that concern had been building quietly, then the wardrobe clearance may have been the first visible sign of a private correction already underway. Administrative control became the blade, access logs, key permissions, storage lists, staff instructions, room assignments. These are the quiet instruments through which the palace can reshape a person's power without ever saying their name in public. Reports suggest that once restricted authority was attached to the East Wing inventory, the move no longer looked like a simple internal adjustment. It looked like a controlled act of bureaucratic warfare, the kind the monarchy has perfected over generations. William's circle, according to insiders, reportedly watched the matter with extreme caution. No statement, no visible celebration, no direct involvement that could be easily traced. Yet the future king's shadow was impossible to ignore because every decision inside the palace now carries the weight of the next reign. Behind all of it stood the legacy of Queen Elizabeth II, not as a spoken command, but as a standard invoked through precedent, documents, and the sacred idea that the crown must never become a private possession. And so Camilla's influence was allegedly not challenged through confrontation, but checked through process. No raised voice was needed. No public humiliation was required. The palace simply moved as it always has when it chooses survival over sentiment, slowly, silently, and with devastating precision. Reports suggest the first shock did not come from the empty rails. It came from the silence around them. No explanation, no restoration plan, no reassurance that the move was temporary for Camilla's closest circle. That silence reportedly landed like an icy verdict. The palace was no longer treating her domestic influence as untouchable. And that silence, according to palace whispers, created a deeper panic than any public statement could have done. Because when Buckingham Palace explains something, it leaves room for negotiation. When it says nothing, it often means the decision has already moved beyond argument. Camilla's aides allegedly tried to understand whether the East Wing clearance was a temporary rearrangement, a storage issue, or part of a wider household adjustment. But the answers, insiders claim, were vague, careful, and cold. No one wanted to confirm too much. No one wanted to deny too much. And that careful refusal to clarify became its own message. For those closest to Camilla, the meaning reportedly began to settle in slowly. The party is over. Not in a loud, cruel, public way, but in the old palace way, through access quietly narrowed, familiar privileges reviewed, and domestic assumptions suddenly treated as permissions rather than rights. Household access, guest protocols, staff movements, and private arrangements were reportedly tightened with the kind of precision that makes every affected person feel the shift before anyone dares to describe it. That is the brutality of palace bureaucracy. It does not need to shout. It simply stops opening doors. The Parker Bowles connection, insiders whisper, became one of the most sensitive pressure points. Not because any formal accusation had been made, but because the old guard reportedly feared that private family comfort could blur into royal access if left unchecked. In the monarchy, family is never just family. Proximity can become influence. Influence can become expectation. Expectation can become entitlement. And once that line begins to fade, the crown has only one choice: restore the boundary before the boundary disappears completely. For Camilla, this alleged moment would have carried a humiliation unlike any public criticism. Public criticism can be answered. Headlines can be dismissed. But a household correction is different. It reaches into the private architecture of daily power. It tells a person not what the world thinks of them, but what the institution is willing to allow them. And if her closest circle truly felt frozen out of certain palace spaces, then the wound was not merely social. It was symbolic. It was institutional. It suggested that the same palace that had once absorbed her rise was now quietly measuring the cost of her reach. And so the cleared wardrobe became more than an absence. It became a warning, a silent line drawn through the heart of royal domestic power, pointing toward an even larger confrontation still waiting behind closed doors. No one inside the palace could miss the cruel timing. King Charles, already carrying the burden of illness and succession pressure, was reportedly forced into the most painful position of his reign: defend Camilla's place or protect the machinery of the crown. And in that narrow space between marriage and monarchy, silence became his only shield. That silence was not weakness in the ordinary sense. It was the silence of a king surrounded by pressures no private man should have to carry and no monarch can fully escape. Since early 2024, Charles's health struggles had already placed a shadow over every royal decision, making every internal adjustment feel sharper, heavier, and more dangerous. Reports suggest that those closest to the institution understood one brutal truth. While the king's heart may have leaned toward protecting his wife from humiliation, the crown demanded something colder. It demanded order. It demanded boundaries. It demanded that no personal attachment be allowed to weaken the structure William would one day inherit. And that is what made the alleged East Wing clearance so explosive. It was not merely a domestic adjustment placed before a tired king. It was a test of loyalty versus institution. If Charles intervened too strongly, he risked making Camilla's household influence appear protected above protocol. If he stayed silent, he allowed the old guard's correction to stand. Either choice carried pain. Either choice revealed something. And inside the palace, where every hesitation is studied like a decree, his reported refusal to publicly challenge the move spoke louder than any defense could have done. Insiders whisper that Princess Anne and Prince Edward's protocol stance left very little room for emotion. Once the matter was framed through household authority, inventories, access chains, and official domestic channels, it became harder to treat as a personal slight. It became process. It became administration. It became the kind of quiet institutional language that even a king cannot easily overturn without exposing the conflict underneath. That was the power of the old guard's move. It did not attack Camilla directly. It placed her influence inside a system where sentiment had no legal handle. And above all of it stood William's future reign, silent but unavoidable. Every room reassigned, every access point reviewed, every private privilege questioned now carried the weight of what kind of monarchy would survive after Charles. Would it be shaped by private loyalties, softened by personal comfort, and vulnerable to household factions? Or would it return to the hard old code, duty first, the firm before the family, the crown above every marriage, every grievance, every ambition? For Charles, that question reportedly cut deeper than politics. It touched love, legacy, guilt, and survival. But the monarchy has never been gentle with those who confuse personal devotion with institutional permission. And as the East Wing's silence hardened, one message seemed to echo through the palace with unforgiving clarity. The crown was larger than one marriage. As Camilla's East Wing presence reportedly diminished, another force became impossible to ignore. Catherine and William did not need to announce authority. They simply embodied it. Their discipline, restraint, and closeness to the future of the monarchy created the contrast courtiers understood instantly. One household was shrinking while another was quietly rising. And that contrast, insiders whisper, became one of the most powerful forces inside the palace. Catherine did not have to issue demands. William did not need to make a dramatic intervention. Their strength came from something far more dangerous to any fading faction: steadiness. While whispers around Camilla's cleared wardrobe stirred questions about access, influence, and the limits of royal marriage, Catherine and William represented continuity. They were not seen as temporary guests inside the system. They were the system's future. And in monarchy, the future is not just symbolic. It changes how people behave in the present. Reports suggest that as the East Wing atmosphere grew colder, courtiers began reading every small adjustment through the lens of succession. Which household received faster responses? Which private arrangements were treated with more care? Which names carried more weight in quiet conversations about schedules, patronages, appearances, and long-term planning? Nothing needed to be said openly because everyone inside the royal machine understood the direction of travel. Charles might still be king. Camilla might still hold her title. But William's reign was no longer a distant idea. It was becoming the shadow behind every decision. Catherine in this telling became the calm counterweight to palace tension. Where Camilla's alleged clearance suggested retreat, Catherine's presence suggested discipline. Where one household was whispered to be facing tighter boundaries, another seemed to be gaining trust through restraint. And that is the old code of monarchy at its most unforgiving. Those who demand space often lose it, while those who appear patient are quietly handed more. It is not always fair. It is not always kind. But it is how royal power has survived for generations. The empty East Wing rails then became more than a private humiliation. They became a marker of generational transfer. The palace was not only asking what Camilla's role should be now. It was asking what kind of monarchy William and Catherine would inherit later. Would it be tangled in personal loyalties and household factions? Or would it return to the iron principle that duty must stand above blood, above comfort, above every private claim? Insiders suggest that this was the true realignment hidden beneath the wardrobe story. Not one woman losing garments, but one era slowly losing gravity as another gathered force. By the time the last garment bag was reportedly carried away, the palace did not need to issue a statement. The message was already written in absence. Empty rails, locked doors, quiet staff, a queen's space reduced without ceremony. And in the unforgiving language of monarchy, what disappears from a royal room often signals what is disappearing from power. What began as a whisper in a locked corridor had now become something far larger than a household mystery. The cleared East Wing wardrobe, once dismissed by some as a private rearrangement, had taken on the weight of a royal verdict. It was not loud. It was not official. It was not wrapped in the language of scandal. But that was precisely what made it so devastating. The monarchy does not always punish through public words. Sometimes it simply removes access, narrows space, changes procedures, and lets the silence speak for itself. For Camilla, the alleged clearance stood as a final symbol of reduced influence. Not the loss of a title, not the removal of a crown, but something more intimate, more cutting, and perhaps more revealing, the quiet disappearance of her daily presence from a part of the palace that had once suggested permanence. Reports suggest that staff understood the meaning immediately. The old guard had not staged a confrontation. They had not invited chaos. They had acted through the cold discipline of protocol. And once protocol takes hold inside the royal household, it becomes almost impossible to reverse without exposing the battle beneath it. Charles, publicly composed, reportedly remained boxed in by the very system he was born to serve. To defend Camilla too openly would risk turning a household correction into a constitutional embarrassment. To remain silent would allow the decision to settle like stone. And so the king appeared trapped between affection and institution, between the woman beside him and the crown above him, while Anne, Edward, and the silent force of precedent seemed to hold the stronger ground. Meanwhile, William and Catherine's future appeared more secure with every quiet adjustment. Their rise did not need celebration. It was written in restraint, discipline, and the growing belief that the next reign must be protected from private factions before it begins. The palace in its own severe way seemed to be returning to the oldest royal law of all. The crown is a sacred trust held for the nation, not a private inheritance to be claimed, softened, or quietly expanded by any one circle. And so the image remains chilling, empty rails where influence once hung, locked doors where access once moved freely, and a silence sharp enough to change the balance of a reign. You are out of free messages until 11:50 p.m. Upgrade. Claw.